Good evening, and welcome. Tonight, we're leaving the modern world behind and traveling back 2,000 years to the Roman Empire. But we're going to skip the emperors, the grand marble palaces, and the roaring gladiator arenas. Instead, we're just going to quietly look at the grounding, gritty reality of what ordinary Romans actually ate every single day. So, get comfortable, and let's begin this relaxing explainer.
Take a slow, gentle breath and picture this. It's just before sunrise in ancient Rome. The city's quiet, the air is cool, and if you pay attention, you can already smell the faint scent of wood fires and fresh dough. While the elite are still fast asleep in their villas, the real engine of the city is already quietly firing up. Let's gently dive into how this magnificent city fed itself as the sun began to rise.
Section 1. Dawn at the bakery. Long before the sun came up, professional bakers were already hard at work over massive stone ovens, quietly producing the daily supply of bread needed to keep thousands alive. Their absolute masterpiece was the panis quadratus. It was this iconic, circular loaf made from bread wheat, divided perfectly into 8 wedges. It was literally everywhere. In fact, archaeologists in Pompeii found 81 of these beautifully scored loaves perfectly preserved in ash, sitting exactly where the baker had abandoned them when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD.
You know, these commercial bakers weren't just everyday cooks. They were absolute heavyweights in society. They formed a powerful trade union called the Corpus Pastorum. Just outside the Porta Maggiore in Rome, there stands the massive tomb of a master baker named Euryses, and his epitaph practically whispers his profession to the world. These men controlled the weak, the fire, and the massive labor forces needed to feed the city. They literally kept Rome standing.
Section 2. The ordinary Roman bowl.
While bread was an absolute staple, the true foundation of the Roman diet actually came in a very simple bowl. Long before the empire expanded to import exotic spices and silver platters, the naturalist Pliny the Elder tells us that Romans proudly called themselves pultifagonides, which literally translates to porridge eaters. And it wasn't an insult either, they wore it as a badge of honor. The everyday people who built the roads and the towering aqueducts, they were raised on a simple, boiled bowl of grain.
The secret to this was pulsus, a thick, comforting porridge made from emmer wheat. For the poorest families, it was just grain cooked in plain hot water with a pinch of salt, night after peaceful night. But it was the ultimate blank canvas. If you had a few extra coins, you might stir in some olive oil, a spoonful of soft cheese, or maybe some seasonal vegetables. And if you were truly wealthy, you'd fold in eggs, sweet honey, or rich meat drippings.
Right alongside that grain were the unsung heroes of the empire, legumes. Things like fava beans, lentils, and chickpeas. If a family had just a tiny half-hectare patch of land, well, they couldn't exactly keep a plowing ox, but they could definitely grow these humble plebeian beans. They didn't require any complex processing like threshing or milling, just pure, cheap grounding protein to complement a mostly vegetarian diet and keep the Roman engine quietly running.
Section 3. Fast food on the street.
As the morning gently warmed up, hundreds of thousands of the urban poor woke up to a harsh reality. They couldn't cook at home. Most lived in insulae. These were cramped, multi-story wooden apartment blocks where people were packed shoulder to shoulder. Imagine having an open cooking fire in a wooden building stacked 6 stories into the sky. It's a terrifying thought. Because of the massive fire hazard, landlords strictly forbade private kitchens. So, if you couldn't cook safely at home, where did you find a warm meal?
Well, you hit the streets. The ancient equivalent of the fast food drive-thru was the Thermopolium. Picture a street-side counter with warm clay pots built right into the stone, softly steaming with hot soups and stews. Compare that to how the elites dined in a triclinium. The wealthy reclined comfortably on couches arranged in a U shape, resting on floors literally built at a 10-degree slope just to make lounging and eating more luxurious. It's truly a tale of 2 completely different worlds.
But just keeping a city of 1 million people fed is a logistical marvel. Enter the Annona, a massive, state-run grain dole. At its absolute height, Rome shipped unfathomable amounts of wheat across the sea from Egypt and North Africa, enough to quietly feed roughly 200,000 registered households. The emperors understood one golden rule. Whoever controls the grain harvests controls the peace of Rome.
Section 4. Garum, the universal flavor.
Despite that massive wealth gap, there was one uniquely pungent ingredient that sat on absolutely every Roman table: garum. It was a universal fish sauce, made by packing whole small fish,
guts, and blood into open-air vats with heavy salt. And then, they just left them in the blazing hot sun for weeks to slowly ferment. It smelled so incredibly strong that the fermentation yards were legally required to be built safely downwind, far outside the city walls. Yet rich or poor, they all dripped that strained, rich amber liquid onto everything they ate. We actually have the biological receipts of what they ate, thanks to modern science. Down by the peaceful coastal port city of Portus Reme and the nearby cemetery of Isola Sacra, scientists have been analyzing skeletal remains. They can softly read the diets of the ancient middle class hidden right there in their bones.
And the stable isotope data of carbon and nitrogen is fascinating. Inland Romans from the Annis site lived off heavily terrestrial diets, like pork, sheep, and legumes. Coastal Romans at Isola Sacra did have access to slightly fancier marine fish, which raised their nitrogen levels. But across the board, the foundation of everyone's total dietary carbon intake was C3 plants, meaning, at the end of the day, terrestrial grains and veggies were the undisputed grounding fuel of all Roman life.
Section 5. The elite's dangerous delicacies.
As the afternoon gently faded to evening, the elites pursued some truly wild and sometimes profoundly perilous delicacies. Your average soldier drank pasca, a humble, refreshing mix of water and cheap, sour wine. But a wealthy senator? He drank fine, imported wine, sweetened with grape syrups called sapa or de frutum. The catch? That syrup was sweetened by being slowly boiled down in highly toxic lead pots. Unknowingly, the elite were slowly poisoning themselves with every luxurious, quiet sip. And the extravagance got even stranger. Meet the glirarium. It was a specialized, hollow terracotta jar designed for one singular purpose, confining and fattening the edible dormouse in near-total darkness. They fed these little rodents a gourmet diet of walnuts, acorns, and chestnuts. It created an entire micro-industry, just to serve a bizarre exotic appetizer at a wealthy man's quiet banquet.
Some elites took this to staggering extremes. The wealthy landowner Titus Pompeius had a 4-square-mile private hunting reserve in Transalpine Gaul. It contained dedicated snail pens, endless rows of beehives, and captive dormice. This was ancient, farm-to-table wealth on a scale that an average Roman sweeping the quiet evening streets couldn't even begin to comprehend.
Section 6. A shared human table. Let's step away from those elite excesses and drift back to a more grounding reality. Without artificial lighting, Roman meals were entirely dictated by the slow rhythm of the sun. They started with intaculum, a quiet, light morning bite of bread. Midday brought prandium, a simple leftover meal. And the main event, the cena, began in the early afternoon, ensuring the food could actually be seen and enjoyed before the absolute, peaceful darkness of the ancient night set in. Nowhere was the quiet dignity of this schedule more evident than in the contuberium, a unit of 8 soldiers out on the frontiers. In the pre-dawn light, they softly ground their grain together by hand. They shared a tent, shared chores, and passed around a warm pot of pulse. They weren't dining on silver platters, but they found a profound sense of shared family and comfort in their simple daily rations.
So, as we bring this explainer to a close, what should we take away from all this? When we strip away the marble statues, the grand legends, and the loud emperors, we're left with everyday people. People who worked hard, seasoned their food, and gathered quietly around the table as the sun went down. The ingredients might have changed, but underneath it all, isn't there something deeply familiar about finding quiet comfort in a shared meal at the end of a long day? It makes you wonder, 2,000 years from now, what will our everyday meals say about us? Thank you for listening, and I wish you a very peaceful,
Good evening, and welcome. Tonight, we're leaving the modern world behind and traveling back 2,000 years to the Roman Empire. But we're going to skip the emperors, the grand marble palaces, and the roaring gladiator arenas. Instead, we're just going to quietly look at the grounding, gritty reality of what ordinary Romans actually ate every single day. So, get comfortable, and let's begin this relaxing explainer.
Take a slow, gentle breath and picture this. It's just before sunrise in ancient Rome. The city's quiet, the air is cool, and if you pay attention, you can already smell the faint scent of wood fires and fresh dough. While the elite are still fast asleep in their villas, the real engine of the city is already quietly firing up. Let's gently dive into how this magnificent city fed itself as the sun began to rise.
Section 1. Dawn at the Bakery. Long before the sun came up, professional bakers were already hard at work over massive stone ovens, quietly producing the daily supply of bread needed to keep thousands alive. Their absolute masterpiece was the panis quadratus. It was this iconic, circular loaf made from bread wheat, divided perfectly into 8 wedges. It was literally everywhere. In fact, archaeologists in Pompeii found 81 of these beautifully scored loaves perfectly preserved in ash, sitting exactly where the baker had abandoned them when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD.
You know, these commercial bakers weren't just everyday cooks. They were absolute heavyweights in society. They formed a powerful trade union called the Corpus Pastorum. Just outside the Porta Maggiore in Rome, there stands the massive tomb of a master baker named Euryses, and his epitaph practically whispers his profession to the world. These men controlled the weak, the fire, and the massive labor forces needed to feed the city. They literally kept Rome standing.
Section 2. The ordinary Roman bowls.
While bread was an absolute staple, the true foundation of the Roman diet actually came in a very simple bowl. Long before the empire expanded to import exotic spices and silver platters, the naturalist Pliny the Elder tells us that Romans proudly called themselves pultifagonides, which literally translates to porridge eaters. And it wasn't an insult either, they wore it as a badge of honor. The everyday people who built the roads and the towering aqueducts, they were raised on a simple, boiled bowl of grain.
The secret to this was pulsus, a thick, comforting porridge made from emmer wheat. For the poorest families, it was just grain cooked in plain hot water with a pinch of salt, night after peaceful night. But it was the ultimate blank canvas. If you had a few extra coins, you might stir in some olive oil, a spoonful of soft cheese, or maybe some seasonal vegetables. And if you were truly wealthy, you'd fold in eggs, sweet honey, or rich meat drippings.
Right alongside that grain were the unsung heroes of the empire, legumes. Things like fava beans, lentils, and chickpeas. If a family had just a tiny half-hectare patch of land, well, they couldn't exactly keep a plowing ox, but they could definitely grow these humble plebeian beans. They didn't require any complex processing like threshing or milling, just pure, cheap grounding protein to complement a mostly vegetarian diet and keep the Roman engine quietly running.
Section 3. Fast food on the street.
As the morning gently warmed up, hundreds of thousands of the urban poor woke up to a harsh reality. They couldn't cook at home. Most lived in insulae. These were cramped, multi-story wooden apartment blocks where people were packed shoulder to shoulder. Imagine having an open cooking fire in a wooden building stacked 6 stories into the sky. It's a terrifying thought. Because of the massive fire hazard, landlords strictly forbade private kitchens. So, if you couldn't cook safely at home, where did you find a warm meal?
While you hit the streets, the ancient equivalent of the fast food drive-thru was the Thermopolium. Picture a street-side counter with warm clay pots built right into the stone, softly steaming with hot soups and stews. Compare that to how the elites dined in a triclinium. The wealthy reclined comfortably on couches arranged in a U shape, resting on floors literally built at a 10-degree slope just to make lounging and eating more luxurious. It's truly a tale of 2 completely different worlds.
But just keeping a city of 1 million people fed is a logistical marvel. Enter the Annona, a massive, state-run grain dole. At its absolute height, Rome shipped unfathomable amounts of wheat across the sea from Egypt and North Africa, enough to quietly feed roughly 200,000 registered households. The emperors understood one golden rule. Whoever controls the grain harvests controls the peace of Rome.
Section 4. Garum, the universal flavor.
Despite that massive wealth gap, there was one uniquely pungent ingredient that sat on absolutely every Roman table: garum. It was a universal fish sauce, made by packing whole small fish, guts, and blood into open-air vats with heavy salt. And then, they just left them in the blazing hot sun for weeks to slowly ferment. It smelled so incredibly strong that the fermentation yards were legally required to be built safely downwind, far outside the city walls. Yet rich or poor, they all dripped that strained, rich amber liquid onto everything they ate.
We actually have the biological receipts of what they ate, thanks to modern science. Down by the peaceful coastal port city of Portus Romae and the nearby cemetery of Isola Sacra, scientists have been analyzing skeletal remains. They can softly read the diets of the ancient middle class hidden right there in their bones. And the stable isotope data of carbon and nitrogen is fascinating. Inland Romans from the Annis site lived off heavily terrestrial diets, like pork, sheep, and legumes.
Coastal Romans at Isola Sacra did have access to slightly fancier marine fish, which raised their nitrogen levels. But across the board, the foundation of everyone's total dietary carbon intake was C3 plants, meaning, at the end of the day, terrestrial grains and veggies were the undisputed grounding fuel of all Roman life.
Section 5. The elite's dangerous delicacies.
As the afternoon gently faded to evening, the elites pursued some truly wild and sometimes profoundly perilous delicacies. Your average soldier drank pasca, a humble, refreshing mix of water and cheap, sour wine. But a wealthy senator? He drank fine, imported wine, sweetened with grape syrups called sapa or de frutum. The catch? That syrup was sweetened by being slowly boiled down in highly toxic lead pots. Unknowingly, the elite were slowly poisoning themselves with every luxurious, quiet sip. And the extravagance got even stranger. Meet the glirarium. It was a specialized, hollow terracotta jar designed for one singular purpose, confining and fattening the edible dormouse in near-total darkness. They fed these little rodents a gourmet diet of walnuts, acorns, and chestnuts. It created an entire micro-industry, just to serve a bizarre exotic appetizer at a wealthy man's quiet banquet.
Some elites took this to staggering extremes. The wealthy landowner Titus Pompeius had a 4-square-mile private hunting reserve in Transalpine Gaul. It contained dedicated snail pens, endless rows of beehives, and captive dormice. This was ancient, farm-to-table wealth on a scale that an average Roman sweeping the quiet evening streets couldn't even begin to comprehend.
Section 6. A shared human table. Let's step away from those elite excesses and drift back to a more grounding reality. Without artificial lighting, Roman meals were entirely dictated by the slow rhythm of the sun. They started with intaculum, a quiet, light morning bite of bread. Midday brought prandium, a simple leftover meal. And the main event, the cena, began in the early afternoon, ensuring the food could actually be seen and enjoyed before the absolute, peaceful darkness of the ancient night set in.
Nowhere was the quiet dignity of this schedule more evident than in the contuberium, a unit of 8 soldiers out on the frontiers. In the pre-dawn light, they softly ground their grain together by hand. They shared a tent, shared chores, and passed around a warm pot of pulse. They weren't dining on silver platters, but they found a profound sense of shared family and comfort in their simple daily rations.
So, as we bring this explainer to a close, what should we take away from all this? When we strip away the marble statues, the grand legends, and the loud emperors, we're left with everyday people. People who worked hard, seasoned their food, and gathered quietly around the table as the sun went down. The ingredients might have changed, but underneath it all, isn't there something deeply familiar about finding quiet comfort in a shared meal at the end of a long day? It makes you wonder, 2,000 years from now, what will our everyday meals say about us? Thank you for listening, and I wish you a very peaceful...
Let's dive right into this explainer. What did ancient Romans really eat every day? Well, when most of us picture Roman meals, our minds immediately jump to opulent banquets, endless wine, grapes being fed to emperors. You know the stereotype. But to truly understand this empire, we have to start way before the sun even comes up. We're going to look at the millions of ordinary people who actually built Rome. Picture this. The first light of dawn is just stretching gently across the rooftops. You step out into the quiet stone alleys. The streets are still incredibly peaceful. A cool breeze drifts through the narrow spaces, and it carries this comforting scent of fresh bread from nearby bakeries. Inside a modest Roman home, the family is already up. A small cooking fire is glowing softly right in the center of the kitchen, its gentle warmth filling the room and prepping them for a really long day of labor. And as this quote highlights, we absolutely have to forget our modern illusions of constant Roman excess. There are no silver platters or exotic meats here. Breakfast in ancient Rome is not a grand feast. It's simple, quick, and highly practical. Most families were just incredibly grateful for some warm bread and a little olive oil. They'd share a quiet morning around a very modest table before the city fully woke up and the noise of donkey carts filled the markets. So, this light early morning meal, it was called the intaculum. Think of it as the ultimate ancient grab-and-go breakfast. For an ordinary family, it was usually yesterday's bread dipped into olive oil, or maybe some wine that had been carefully diluted with water. If you were really lucky, maybe a little soft cheese, some fresh olives in a clay bowl, or a handful of dried dates and figs for a quick burst of energy. This was purely practical fuel. It was exactly what kept the carpenters, the blacksmiths, and the stonemasons going during those grueling hours of physical labor. For many Romans, bread was the absolute centerpiece of their entire diet. It was affordable, it was filling, and it was available to almost everyone. Now, the most iconic loaf we know of, which was actually perfectly preserved in the volcanic ash of Pompeii, is the panes quadratus. It's this large, circular loaf that was cleverly pre-scored into easy-to-share sections. Seriously, it's the bread that fed the empire. But to keep roughly 1 million citizens fed in the capital alone, Rome needed a massive commercial baking industry, and the sheer industrial scale of this operation is just staggering. By the 2nd century BC, it was a highly organized machine. First, grain was shipped all the way across the Mediterranean from Egypt and North Africa. Then, donkeys, and tragically slave labor, tirelessly rotated industrial grain mills. The dough was paddled by mechanical wooden bar kneading machines, and finally it was baked in these massive ovens that were fired from dusk until dawn by powerful master bakers known as pastores. These pastores could become fabulously wealthy. Take Marcus Virgilius Eurysace. He was likely a former slave who made an absolute fortune baking bread. He literally built a massive monument for himself in Rome, designed with circular openings that look exactly like grain measuring vessels. But the most incredible, kind of touching detail? He honored his wife, Tistia, by placing her remains in a specialized urn shaped exactly like a baker's bread basket. You can read the inscription for yourself right there.
Okay, so that's breakfast, but what about lunch and dinner for the average working Roman? Well, most ordinary citizens rented apartments called insulae. These things were stacked 5 or 6 stories high, and because they were made mostly of wood, landlords strictly banned indoor kitchens. It was just a massive fire hazard. So the working class relied heavily on the thermopolium. Think of these as ancient fast food counters built right into street corners. They had these wide clay pots sunk right into the marble counters to keep stews and meats warm all day for anyone passing by.
The absolute crucial takeaway here is that long before luxury banquets were a Roman stereotype, the empire was actually built by people surviving on pulse. Pulse is a thick, hearty wheat porridge. In fact, for the first 3 centuries of Rome's existence, this dish was so central to their identity that Pliny the Elder noted the Romans proudly called themselves pultafagonades. And yeah, that literally translates to porridge eaters.
To complement that daily grain and porridge, Romans relied heavily on legumes. Varieties like the fava beans you see here were the absolute lifeblood of the masses. You have to remember, a small urban plot couldn't support plowing animals for meat, so these beans provided the essential, cheap protein needed to balance out what was a mostly vegetarian working-class diet. They just soaked them quietly in a clay pot, ready to be cooked up for the evening meal.
But this terrestrial, plant-heavy diet wasn't the rule everywhere. If we look outside the city center, a completely different culinary story emerges. Take a look at this map showing the coastal trading hub of Portus Rame and the nearby Isola Sacra Necropolis. That was a burial site for middle-class administrators and merchants between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD.
By using isotopic paleo-diet studies, which is essentially chemical detective work, researchers compared the skeletons from that coastal Isola Sacra cemetery to an inland farming cemetery known as Annis. And the contrast? It was stark. While the inland farmers relied almost entirely on land-based crops, the coastal workers had significantly elevated nitrogen isotopes. So this scientific data proves that if you live near the coast, marine fish were a massive part of your everyday survival. And speaking of the sea, there was one ingredient that crossed every single social divide in Rome: garum. Think of it as the ketchup or soy sauce of the ancient world. Except, well, it was a highly pungent, incredibly salty sauce fermented from fish parts and blood. I know it sounds intense, but seriously, whether you were a frontier soldier eating cheap, watered-down hydrogarum, or an elite senator drizzling a premium vintage garum from Pompeii over your meal, absolutely everyone consumed it. They even mixed it into wine and used it as medicine. It was everywhere.
As the sun sets and we move to the main dinner, known as the cena, the incredible wealth gap of the empire becomes blindingly obvious. For the rich, this meal took place in a specialized dining room called a triclinium. Diners would actually trade their street shoes for soft sandals, wash their hands in perfumed water, and recline on 3 U-shaped couches, eating meticulously prepared courses over several hours.
And at the very top of that social ladder, the excess was just staggering. 900 million. That astronomical number is the amount of sesterces the historian Tacitus claims Emperor Vitellius burned through on feasts in just a few months. That's right, months. He famously commissioned a massive silver platter called the Shield of Minerva, and he loaded it with imported absurd delicacies like flamingo tongues, peacock brains, and pike livers, literally eating a fortune.
This table really hits the nail on the head. It shows us 2 entirely different Romes.
On one side, you have an emperor dining on flamingo tongues and dormice while reclining on plush couches, an opulent lifestyle built entirely on the labor of unnamed slaves. And on the other side, the ordinary soldier or citizen. They're eating simple wheat porridge out of a clay bowl, maybe sitting on a plain wooden stool, and washing it down with a rough mix of water and sour wine called pasca. Night and day, right?
But here's a crazy twist. All that elite refinement came with a terrifying, invisible cost. To sweeten their fine wines, Roman cooks would boil grape juice down into rich syrups like sapa or defrutum. The catch? Agricultural writers specifically recommended boiling these syrups in lead pots because bronze left a bad taste. So, ironically, the wealthiest Romans were slowly, unknowingly poisoning themselves with lead. Meanwhile, the poorest citizens drinking their cheap, sour pasca completely avoided this toxic fate.
It's a pretty provocative thought to leave you with, isn't it? When we think of Rome, it's so easy to picture the marble palaces, the silver shields, and those reclining couches. But maybe the true story of this massive empire isn't found on a solid silver platter at all. Perhaps it's found inside the humble clay bowls of the millions of ordinary people who woke up before sunrise, ate a simple piece of bread dipped in oil, and actually went out and built the world they lived in. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this completely changes how you look at the daily life of ancient Rome.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're actually going to do something a little bit different. We're stepping away from the grand battles, the famous emperors, and we're exploring something much quieter, but honestly, arguably a lot more important. We are transporting ourselves back 2,000 years to experience a peaceful, sensory journey into an ordinary morning meal in ancient Rome. Sometimes this kind of everyday routine gets labeled as boring history for sleep, but I promise you, the mechanics and the quiet magic of this daily ritual are absolutely captivating.
So what did an ordinary Roman actually eat as the sun came up? Imagine the hushed streets of Rome just before dawn, a simple trinity of foods, prepared in absolute tranquility, literally fueled the greatest empire of the ancient world. Let's dive right in and see exactly how that morning unfolded.
Section 1. Before dawn at the bakery.
Long before the city of 1 million people wakes up, our neighborhood baker is already out of bed, working by the steady, quiet glow of a clay oil lamp. As he gently pours grain into these heavy volcanic millstones, just consider the sheer scale of the Roman operation. Rome required a staggering 272,000 tons of grain every single year just to feed its citizens. I mean, every handful of wheat he grinds represents countless hours of farming and careful human effort.
Supplying all this wheat was this massive logistical marvel known as the Cura Annone. It was a regular, state-subsidized supply line quietly connecting distant farmers to the daily labor of our local bakers. But, for ordinary families, the focus was much simpler. While the finest, lightest bread was made from expensive wheat, a lot of families enjoyed darker, heavier, and deeply filling loaves made from barley or other everyday grains to keep them nourished.
And this imported grain formed the absolute core of their diet, what we call the Mediterranean triad. Grain made up roughly 60% of their daily caloric intake, which was beautifully balanced with about 20% olive oil and 20% wine and grapes. It was a simple, incredibly accessible trinity that gave every Roman, from the merchant to the craftsman to the child, the quiet strength to face the day.
Section 2. Baking the panis quadratus.
Returning to the peaceful bakery, the baker mixes cool water, valuable sea salt, and a sourdough starter known as papadidius. As the loaves bake in glowing stone ovens, the smells just drift through every neighborhood. The dough carries this comforting, earthy aroma of natural leavening, and we know from places like Pompeii that it was sometimes wonderfully enhanced with poppy seed, fennel, or parsley. For many Romans, this familiar scent simply signals the peaceful beginning of another day.
The baker's entire rhythm relied on continuity. As the Roman historian Pliny the Elder reverently observed, they do not warm it at all, but only make use of a little of the dough that has been kept from the day before. Before commercial yeast even existed, this beautiful, continuous cycle meant that every single loaf of bread literally contained a tiny, unbroken piece of the day before.
This daily baking rhythm actually shifted across the week, producing different loaves for completely different needs. It culminated on Wednesday with the famous panis quadratus, which was cleverly scored into 8 distinct wedges before baking, so it could be easily broken and shared without a knife. And alongside these shared loaves, families would often enjoy seasonal fresh fruits, things like figs, grapes, apples, and pears, adding a really welcome natural sweetness to the table. Section 3. Olive oil and mortem.
As those beautiful golden loaves emerge from the oven, ordinary Romans begin to wake. Fresh, warm bread is often broken off and gently dipped directly into a small clay dish of olive oil. And this golden liquid was so precious and versatile that it provided not only nourishing food, but also medicine and the very fuel for the lamps that lit the pre-dawn darkness.
Now, to add a bit more flavor, families might prepare something called mortem. They'd crush together fresh ingredients using a mortar and pestle. Herbs like mint, thyme, and coriander grew so easily in the Mediterranean climate, crushed alongside walnuts or pine nuts and blended with fresh ricotta-like cheese, olive oil, a splash of vinegar, and salt. These simple ingredients became something incredibly special through that careful preparation.
Section 4. Columella's ancient Roman cheese.
To complete this humble meal, a piece of fresh cheese was placed on the table, and the ancient process for this, detailed by writers like Columella, was intimately tied to nature. First, you'd milk the sheep or goat. Then, brilliantly, you add the milky sap of a green fig tree branch to gently coagulate the warm milk. You drain those curds in woven wicker baskets, and finally, brine it in seawater to firm and flavor it perfectly. As Columella noted, there is no doubt that cheese which has been solidified by means of small shoots from a fig tree has a very pleasant flavor. This botanical fig rennet gave the cheese a unique, slightly tangy taste. Served right beside that warm bread and olive oil, this small piece of sheep or goat's cheese created a morning meal that was grounding and deeply satisfying for the whole family.
Section 5. A peaceful morning meal.
With the sun now shining warmly over the marble temples and quiet courtyards of Rome, the family gathers for their anteculum at dawn. Unlike the lavish, theatrical evening feasts of the elite that we so often hear about, this morning meal was an intimate, calming ritual. As they ate, conversation remained gentle. Plans for the day were quietly discussed while children listened carefully, finishing off their very last pieces of bread.
There is just immense, quiet strength in a simple meal like this. Nothing is wasted. Even small crumbs are carefully collected. Before these citizens step out into the bustling marketplace to sell pottery or head out to work in the olive groves, they savor their food, understanding deeply that every single loaf represents months of careful human effort, from planting the wheat all the way to the baker's warm fires.
What's really fascinating about this entire topic is the shift in perspective it gives us. We so often remember the generals, the emperors, and those imposing marble monuments. But it was these peaceful, ordinary mornings and the simple, steady work of the baker, the farmer, and the family that truly built the history of the Roman Empire.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought. The next time you begin your own day, maybe the next time you dip a piece of warm bread into a dish of olive oil or share a wedge of cheese with someone, ask yourself, how might this quiet, timeless ritual connect you to those who lived and breathed beneath the Mediterranean sun 2,000 years ago? History isn't just in the past, it's right there on our plates. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring the fascinating world around you.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're stepping back in time for a deeply immersive, peaceful stroll through an ancient Roman morning. We're going to discover what the Romans really ate every single day, from the simplest, warmest bread to the most complex, empire-spanning spices. It's a truly fascinating journey that reveals so much about their daily routines, their social structures, and the sheer, breathtaking scale of the Roman world. Picture this. Warm sunlight is just starting to fill the streets of ancient Rome. The city is alive. Yet, even among thousands of people, there's a gentle, steady rhythm to everyday life. As you walk along the smooth, stone streets, you hear the soft sound of leather sandals against the pavement. Wooden carts roll slowly past, their wheels keeping time over the ancient cobblestones. Nearby, a small fountain flows peacefully. We're making our way toward one of the busiest, yet strangely calming places in the ancient world. Okay, let's dive into exactly where we are. We have arrived at the Macellum, the ancient Roman indoor food market. Now, this wasn't some chaotic bazaar. It was a highly structured architectural marvel modeled right after Greek agoras. You typically walk through these grand central gates into a square courtyard, surrounded by small, uniform shops called tabernae. Right in the very center stood a domed, round structure known as a tholos. Inside, the stalls were organized in a loose, traditional Roman way. Fish up front, meat deeper inside, vegetables along the sides, and spices tucked quietly in the back. Section 1. The Foundation of Bread. As we move past the market entrance, the warm, comforting scent of golden crusts just completely surrounds us. A nearby baker is pulling fresh loaves from a stone oven. Now, unlike a modern supermarket, that simple, wonderful smell of baking bread represents intense, careful work and a massive logistical machine. For the Romans, bread was the absolute centerpiece of their diet. It accounted for a huge chunk of their daily calories. And to keep over 1 million citizens fed, the empire had to pull off literal miracles of logistics. To put that macro scale into perspective, just think about the number 272,000. That is the estimated tons of grain Rome imported every single year just to feed its residents. To really visualize that, it's roughly the weight of 1,500 blue whales. This massive undertaking was run by the state logistics system. Grain was shipped all the way across the Mediterranean from places like Egypt and North Africa on huge, privately owned fleets, all just to ensure the baker and Armacellum had flour to mill for the morning rush. But not all bread was created equal back then. Your social status dictated exactly what ended up on your plate. The wealthy elite enjoyed something called panis silignaeus. This was a high-quality, soft white bread made from finely sieved flour, actually pretty close to the white bread we eat today. Meanwhile, commoners, soldiers, and everyday working folks ate dense, darker loaves made from bran or whole wheat. Basically, the physical texture of your breakfast was a direct reflection of your rank in society. Section 2. The catch of the day. Leaving the gentle warmth of the baker, we wander over to the fishmongers near the entrance. Here, the silver scales of sea bass, mackerel, and sardines are shining brightly under the sun. The vendor doesn't just shout out the type of fish, he announces its condition. Fresh, very fresh from the harbor this morning, still cold, still firm. It's almost a challenge, right? A buyer steps up, silently reaches into the tray, presses the flesh, and checks her fingers. The whole transaction takes maybe 15 seconds. But in Rome, a fresh catch wasn't just dinner, it was a major status symbol. This is where the economics get really fascinating. Based on Diocletian's price edict from 301 AD, we can see the stark reality of the fish market. First-quality marine fish cost a staggering 24 denarii per pound. Freshwater fish was a bit cheaper at 12 denarii, while salted fish dropped all the way down to 6. The market assigned immense monetary and therefore social value to these different types of seafood. So if you were a wealthy patrician, you might gift a wildly expensive, massive, fresh red mullet to a patron just to gain political favor. But the everyday Roman? They relied on something completely different. Plebeians turned to affordable, salted fish and garum. Garum was this omnipresent, highly pungent fermented fish sauce that added a savory, salty kick to almost every Roman dish. Salting the fish didn't just preserve it, it made vital protein accessible to the masses across the entire empire. Section 3. Vegetables, Spices, and Scents. Moving deeper into the market along the left colonnade, things get a bit quieter, a bit more colorful. This is where local agriculture meets the edges of the empire. The vegetable section is a total sensory explosion. The stalls are just overflowing with cabbage, forearm-length leeks, and onions. You can see garlic hanging in thick braided ropes, and the fruit. Baskets of grapes, apples, and pomegranates everywhere. But the absolute best are the figs, already splitting at their seams. Their sweet, slightly fermented scent literally reaches you before you even walk up to the stall. But as we head toward the back of the market, where the light is a little dimmer, the atmosphere shifts completely. We've reached the spice vendors. The smells here have absolutely no Roman equivalent. We're talking about black pepper from India, cinnamon from beyond Egypt, and ginger from places so far east that most buyers couldn't even point to them on a map. These scents hang in the air as a literal fact of empire. They are living proof the trade routes spanning unimaginable distances were wide open and flowing right into this peaceful square. What's truly mind-blowing about all this is the invisible network operating right under the surface. It was, actually, scratch that, it wasn't just a market. It was an incredibly complex network for moving economic information. Merchants had to carefully assess the immense distances these spices traveled just to set their prices. Information about which ships had arrived at the harbor and how prices in one district compared to another flowed through these stone colonnades just as swiftly as the goods themselves. Section 4. Banquets and Social Bites. As the morning hours drift away, we can watch families finish up their shopping, maybe grabbing a loaf of bread, some fresh goat cheese, onions, and olives, and heading home. You see, Roman eating followed a very specific timeline. The day began with iantaculum, a super frugal breakfast of bread dipped in wine. maybe with a little cheese. Next came prandium, a quick, cold lunch, usually made from leftovers, so it wouldn't interrupt the workday. Finally, at dusk, came the cena, the main evening meal. For the rich, this meant elaborate banquets. For the everyday plebeian, it usually meant a hearty, simple bean stew or porridge, maybe flavored with cheap, salted fish. But hold on, did the lower classes literally only ever eat simple stews? Not at all, and this is where it gets super interesting. We have to look at the collegia. These were voluntary associations and guilds, often acting as burial societies, that were open to plebeians, freedmen, and even slaves. Yes, they made sure you got a proper funeral, but they also acted as vital social hubs. They hosted highly organized regular banquets, which gave everyday folks a chance to sit down and temporarily dine just like aristocrats. We actually have the receipts for this. There's an incredible regulation carved into stone all the way back in 136 AD from the College of Diana and Antinous in Lanuvium. It legally guarantees 6 grand meals a year for its members. The rules say, and I quote, "The presidents of the dinners shall provide each an amphora of good wine, and for 2 asses of bread, 4 sardi, the garniture, and hot water." Now, for the longest time, historians translated that word sarda as sardine, which sounds like a pretty meager meal, right? But recent historical corrections, looking at the writings of Pliny the Elder, show that sarda actually meant premium, highly prized tuna. Just imagine this banquet: good quality wine, fresh bread, hot water for mixing, and premium tuna. These collegia banquets brilliantly brought high society dining codes right down to the lower classes, giving them a taste of luxury 6 times a year. As the gentle rhythm of the bustling market fades into a quiet, peaceful Roman evening, I want to leave you with a lingering thought. How did the simple contents of a shopping basket reflect the vast social and economic weight of the entire Roman Empire? From the massive grain fleets crossing the sea to the fragrant spice routes bridging continents, every bite of bread and every single dash of pepper told a story of power, logistics, and daily life. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history hidden in the everyday. Let's dive right into this explainer and explore the fascinating, contrasting culinary worlds of ancient Rome. You know, when we think of Roman dining, our minds usually jump straight to those decadent emperors lounging on couches, dropping peeled grapes into their mouths. But to truly understand this magnificent empire, we have to look at what fueled it from the ground up, every single day. Close your eyes for just a second and imagine this scene. The sun hangs high above the city of Rome, and the streets are warm beneath that gentle Mediterranean light. The absolute busiest hours of the morning have passed. Merchants are serving their regular customers, craftsmen are busy inside their workshops, and you can hear children laughing softly as they play in quiet courtyards. Across this massive metropolis of nearly 1 million people, everyone is beginning to think about their next meal. Now, obviously, not everyone eats the same food. The wealthy enjoy vast private gardens and tables filled with exotic dishes, while ordinary families live much, much more simply. But whether you're a rich patrician or a poor plebeian, you share one absolute truth: food is precious. Section 1. The daily rhythm of meals. Let's look at how their day was structured. It's really fascinating how familiar, yet entirely different, this routine is to ours. The Roman day began with the intaculum, which was a very modest, frugal breakfast. We're talking maybe a bit of bread dipped in water or wine, a piece of cheese, or a handful of olives. Later in the morning came prandium, a quick lunch. This was often just cold leftovers from the day before, designed to be fast so it wouldn't interrupt the workday. And finally, at dusk, came the cena. This was the main event. For the wealthy, it was a sprawling banquet, but for the working class, it was usually just a single hearty pot of bubbling stew. Section 2, bread, the faithful companion. Let's talk about the foundation of the Roman diet. 272,000 tons. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the estimated amount of grain imported into Rome every single year just to feed its booming population. To keep the rest of lower classes content, the Roman state operated the cura annona. This was a massive, incredibly complex supply chain that brought subsidized and eventually entirely free grain from provinces like Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily straight to the capital. It's the famous bread and circuses concept you've probably heard of. Bread wasn't just a side dish, it was literally the primary source of daily calories. So how did that massive global supply chain actually look on the ground? Well, this is an actual Roman clay oven and hand mill discovered in a military camp. Because of the extremely high fire risk in crowded apartment blocks, which they called insula, most urban Romans actually weren't allowed to have cooking fires indoors, so they relied heavily on local bakeries. Or, if they were out in the countryside or in the military, they gathered around small, intimate fires just like this one to bake their daily bread. And the engineering behind this is absolutely brilliant. The Roman hand mill was a huge step up from earlier Celtic designs. Notice the heavy lava stone and those meticulously sharpened grinding surfaces. The Romans specifically chose hard, compact lava stone for a reason. It was incredibly wear-resistant. Why does that matter? Well, if you use softer stones, they shed fine rock dust right into the flour. You can't wash that out, and it would absolutely ruin your teeth over time. So these mills ensured a fine, clean grist for everyone. But here's the crucial point. Not all bread was created equal. For a wealthy Roman family, lunch might include panis seleneus, a spongy, beautifully leavened, warm white bread made from high-gluten wheat. It was light and sweet. Meanwhile, the ordinary citizen relied on panis plebeius, which was a heavy, dense, dark bread made from bran and barley. But remember what we said earlier about food being precious? Even when that plebeian bread went totally rock-hard stale, it was never, ever thrown away. It was carefully softened with water, toasted by the fire, or dropped into a soup. Absolutely nothing was wasted. Section 3, fresh catch and salted fish. Let's head over to the markets. If you were looking for meat or seafood in Rome, you went to the Macellum. Modeled after the Greek agoras, the Macellum was basically the beating heart of Roman food commerce. Picture walking into a bustling, noisy indoor market situated right near the Forum, just completely filled with the sights and smells of the daily catch brought in from nearby coastal towns. And this right here reveals the stark economic reality of the time. This is Diocletian's price edict, literally carved into stone. First-quality marine fish cost 24 denarii a pound, but salted preserved fish, just 6 denarii. To put that into perspective, it shows exactly why fresh ocean fish was a massive status symbol reserved only for the wealthy, while preserved salted fish remained the accessible, everyday staple it kept the working class fed. Actually, fresh fish had such high social value that social climbers would literally gift massive fresh turbots, or mullets, to public officials just to impress them. It was the ultimate ancient flex. Meanwhile, the ordinary plebeian relied heavily on garum. Garum was an omnipresent, fermented fish sauce. It delivered this incredibly savory, salty, umami punch to their simple meals, making cheap bowls of beans or porridge absolutely delicious. Section 4, A Tale of Two Kitchens. Let's peek inside as evening approaches. As the afternoon slowly moves toward evening, let's look at the two extremes of Roman life. In the patrician villa, the dining room is cool and comfortable. Sunlight enters through an open courtyard, a fountain quietly bubbles, and skilled cooks are preparing fresh olives, roasted lamb, sweet figs, and dishes glazed with honey and imported spices. It's unhurried luxury. Across the city, in a modest apartment, it's a very different scene. A single fire burns beneath a clay pot. Inside, pulse, a hearty barley and vegetable stew, slowly bubbles away. A handful of beans cooks beside chopped onions, leeks, and a bit of cheap goat cheese. No two stews are exactly alike, but they all share the same purpose: feeding a family with care and patience. And yet, this quote from the Roman philosopher Seneca really grounds us. He wrote, "Nature has nothing to do with whether I eat poor men's bread or one made of fine flour." Because regardless of wealth, the ultimate purpose of this food was exactly the same: to provide the essential strength needed for a hard day's work. Whether you were a builder lifting heavy stones under the hot sun, a farmer caring for vineyards, a blacksmith shaping glowing iron, or a potter spinning wet clay, your meal gave you the energy to survive and build an empire. Section 5, Banquets of the People. How the Working Class Feasted. Now, life wasn't just endless toil and stale bread for the working class. The poorest citizens actually managed to occasionally eat like emperors through things called collegia. For a long time, historians thought these were just gloomy funeral funds, a way for poor people to save up for a decent burial. But actually, scratch that, they were so much more. They were vibrant social clubs. Craftsmen, plebeians, and even slaves pooled their meager resources to share in the joy of true lavish feasts, temporarily erasing those rigid social hierarchies of the streets outside. We know exactly how these worked thanks to rules carved in stone at Lanuvium. Take the Collegium of Diane and Antinous. A wealthy patron gave them a massive 15,000 sesterces endowment, and the interest from this funded 6 elaborate banquets every single year. The rules were strict. Cause a scene and you're fined 4 sesterces. But if you behaved, even if you were an enslaved person, sat down as an absolute equal to enjoy warm wine, fresh bread, and high-quality food. And this is where modern historical detective work changes everything. For a long time, historians translating the rules of these banquets saw the word sarda and assumed the poor were just eating cheap, salted sardines. But a deep dive into Pliny the Elder's natural history reveals that sarda actually referred to large Atlantic tuna. These working-class diners weren't eating cheap scraps, no way. By pooling their money, they were feasting on highly prized, delicious cuts of fresh tuna that they could never, ever afford on their own. It's a beautiful image, isn't it? As the afternoon fades and cooking fires appear across the city, thin trails of smoke rise into the clear Roman sky. The comforting smell of bread, herbs, and warm olive oil drifts through the streets. In an empire defined by massive inequality, a shared table allowed the poorest citizens to taste luxury, dignity, and equality, if only for a few hours. So I'll leave you with this question. Does the simple act of breaking bread together still hold that same unifying power to bridge the deepest social divides in our world today? Think about that next time you sit down to dinner. Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and keep feeding your curiosity. Hey everyone, welcome to today's explainer. Today, we're diving into exactly what ancient Romans really ate every day. And, we're going to explore a deeply fascinating yet surprisingly calming corner of history. I want you to step back in time with me for a bit. Let's get far away from the busy, crowded marketplaces and those grand marble monuments of Rome. Instead, we're placing ourselves on a well-built Roman road, just as the day is slowly giving way to dusk. Picture this. The afternoon sun is shining brightly across the Roman countryside, and the light is just starting to turn that perfect shade of golden. You can almost feel the sensory details of the march, right? There's this incredibly calm, steady rhythm of thousands of leather sandals pressing gently against the smooth stone of the road. The soldiers' shields are resting comfortably on their backs, and their spears are just catching the very last warm rays of sunlight. Now, when we think of Roman soldiers, we are totally conditioned to picture grand military victories, massive formations, and chaotic, intense battles. But out here on the road, a completely different kind of life quietly unfolds. Much of their actual day-to-day lives were surprisingly ordinary, because underneath all that heavy armor, they were just regular people who needed to eat, who needed to cook, and who had to carefully prepare for tomorrow before they could finally get some rest. Which brings us to Section 1, the army's supply chain and feeding the empire's backbone. To truly appreciate the peaceful campfire scene we're about to walk into, we really need to understand the massive, macro-level logistics that made it all possible across the entire empire. The absolutely crucial element here is something called the annone militaris. Feeding this massive army was, without a doubt, paramount. Starting around the late 2nd century, this system of food provision became a literal logistical machine. It pulled immense surpluses of grain and supplies from local economies, sometimes, siphoning them off a bit forcefully from the civilian populations. The stark reality was that the needs of the military were always prioritized over the needs of civilians, no questions asked. That steady supply chain is what kept the marching legs moving. But you might be wondering, what happens when the heavy supply wagons couldn't keep up? While on the march, fresh fruit was incredibly rare because it spoiled so fast. So the soldiers carried what was basically ancient trail mix, highly efficient, easily transportable rations. We're talking dried figs, raisins, walnuts, and almonds. These small, super nutrient-dense foods provided a slow, lasting energy that was absolutely vital during those grueling marches across the dusty roads of the empire. Let's move into Section 2, the daily military grind, dealing with bread, stone, and routine. Let's zoom back in to the individual soldiers. As the day's journey wraps up, the soldiers start setting up camp. And the core of this camp is the contubernanium, which was a tight-knit unit of 8 to 10 soldiers who literally lived, marched, and ate together every single day. Every single one of these squads carried their own hand mill, a Roman rotary quern. Grinding grain wasn't just outsourced to some massive bakery back in the city while they were out on the frontier. No, it was a daily, patient, and honestly pretty unglamorous routine handled right there at the campsite. The Army's central supply mostly provided raw grain, not finished bread, so hauling these heavy stone tools around was essential for their survival. And there is some seriously fascinating engineering behind these mills. The Romans deliberately chose hard, compact lava stone. Why go through the trouble? Well, because it was highly wear-resistant. If you use a softer stone, little bits of stone powder and dust break off and get mixed into your flour. And as any ancient baker could tell you, fine flour simply cannot be washed to remove stone dust without completely ruining it. So the Romans intentionally designed these from lava stone to prevent that gritty, awful contamination. To put this into perspective, when we compare this to earlier technologies, we see a massive leap. The older Celtic querns were smaller, about 35 centimeters across, and the short distance between the stones produced this really coarse semolina. But the Roman military mill was a perfected, standardized tool. It was larger, pushing 37 to 42 centimeters. This wider diameter meant the grain had a much longer route to travel between the grinding surfaces, crushing it perfectly into a surprisingly fine flour. This tech upgrade is exactly what allowed the soldiers to bake a high-quality white bread right out there in the middle of a muddy field. Okay, moving on to section 3, pulse, pork, and garum. This is all about the sensory experience of the campfire. Let's shift our focus to the evening settling in. Firewood has been gathered up from nearby trees, and small cooking fires are carefully lit. Thin trails of wood smoke are rising peacefully into the darkening sky, and the main evening meal, the cena, is just beginning to take shape. Alongside their freshly baked bread, they prepared something called pulse. Now, this was a thick, warm cereal porridge simmering away in large iron pots over the glowing embers. The base was just wheat or barley and water. Then they'd toss in vegetables, beans, onions, garlic, maybe some carrots or cabbage if they were lucky. And for flavoring, if supplies were generous that week, they used small chunks of salted pork or smoked bacon, a handful of herbs, and of course, garum. Garum was that famously salty, deeply flavorful fermented fish sauce they put on almost everything. Imagine that rich, savory aroma drifting quietly through the camp. Another key protein source comes to us from a note by the ancient physician Galen. He wrote that dogfish were normally salted and consumed by ordinary people. He explained that because their flesh is pretty firm and full of, as he put it, residues, people would salt them first. So, salted, preserved fish wasn't just some fancy delicacy for the Roman elite in their villas. It was a highly transportable, vital staple for agricultural laborers, city dwellers, and absolutely for these soldiers on long marches far from the sea. As we enter Section 4, a quiet Roman evening, we get to watch the empire at rest. The pacing of the entire camp begins to slow down beautifully. The thick, satisfying stew has been eaten. To wash it all down, water remains the most common drink, but it's often mixed with a little bit of diluted wine. This wasn't a party. That practice actually made the water safer to drink and deeply refreshed the tired travelers after spending hours pounding those dusty stone roads. So the wooden bowls are cleaned carefully. Nothing at all is wasted. The evening chores are remarkably peaceful. Leftover bread is wrapped meticulously in cloth to be saved for tomorrow's journey. Soldiers sit around the fading embers, engaging in quiet maintenance, maybe repairing a broken strap on their leather sandals or sharpening their tools. They speak softly. They talk of distant homes, of their families, and of the farms and quiet villages waiting for them, far, far away from the frontier. Above them, the evening sky slowly fills with countless stars. The air turns cooler. The sharp, loud noises of the marching day have entirely vanished, replaced only by the gentle crackling of the fire burning lower and the sounds of birds gradually fading into the ambient rhythmic call of night insects. The deep, specific silence of sleep begins to settle over the camp. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. The true might of Rome wasn't just in the dramatic clash of swords. It was in the incredible, unglamorous consistency of its logistics. Baking the bread, grinding the stone, simmering the pulse day after day. If one of history's greatest empires was built not on fleeting moments of glory, but on simple food and patient daily routines, what daily routines are quietly building your future? Thanks so much for joining me today. Until next time, remember to appreciate the quiet moments of the grind.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping back about 2,000 years to really experience the sights, sounds, and honestly the mouth-watering smells of an ancient Roman street corner. You know, we usually think of Rome in terms of these grand marble temples, sweeping gladiatorial arenas, and emperors in purple robes. But right now, we're looking at the city from the ground up, right at the street level.
We want to see how the everyday people of this massive empire actually lived, and more importantly, how they ate.
Okay, let's kick things off with a pretty simple question. Where did the vast majority of citizens in the greatest city on Earth actually prepare their dinner? Just think about it for a second. You've got a sprawling metropolis of over 1 million people, bustling with laborers, artisans, and merchants. So where were they all firing up their stoves at the end of the day?
Well, the surprising answer is they didn't, at all. If you're an average working-class Roman citizen, you'd come home every single night to an apartment with no stove, no oven, and nowhere to even boil a pot of water. You basically ate out for virtually every single meal.
To understand why, we have to listen to the absolute nighttime chaos of ancient Rome's supply chain. The poet Juvenal actually complained about this, describing how heavy carts rattled through the dark streets, making sleep completely impossible. You see, daytime wheeled traffic was strictly banned in Rome to prevent deadly pedestrian accidents in those super narrow alleys. So all the food for the entire city, every squawking chicken, every barrel of wine, every crate of fish, had to be hauled in during pitch darkness, keeping half the city awake.
Section 1. The City Without Kitchens.
There was a massive, undeniable class divide in Rome. The wealthy elite dined in these expansive villas with private kitchens and entire teams of enslaved cooks preparing elaborate feasts. But the working class, they lived a totally different reality. They were crammed into multi-story apartment buildings known as insulae. These were tiny, wooden-framed rooms stacked sometimes 6 stories into the air. And in those cramped spaces, lighting an indoor cooking fire was practically a death sentence.
Because these towering insulae had no running water or safe ventilation, millions of hungry Romans were quite literally pushed out of their homes and into the bustling streets for every meal. For these families, buying freshly prepared food was just way easier and safer than cooking. The city streets essentially became their shared kitchen.
Section 2. The Midnight Market Run.
This massive daily demand meant street food vendors had to start their day in absolute darkness. Before the sun even thought about rising, our ancient fast food workers were already on the clock. First, they'd navigate the pitch-black streets during the third watch of the night, heading down to the Tiber River docks, where boats were unloading fresh catches. Then they'd move to the sprawling Messalin market to meticulously source grain, vegetables, and meats. By first light, they were back at their stalls, stoking the coals and prepping the day's meals. Every single ingredient required immense, patient, hard work long before a customer ever showed up.
Section 3. Inside the Roman Thermopolium. By daybreak, these vendors operated out of incredibly specialized establishments called Thermopolia. Picture a waist-high stone counter, often beautifully decorated with intricate frescoes. Embedded right into the masonry were large clay jars called dolia. These jars acted as ancient holding warmers and coolers, keeping a variety of pre-prepared dishes at the perfect temperature. Customers could just walk up, point at what they wanted, drop a few coins, and eat right there on the street.
And get this number, because it's absolutely staggering. Archaeologists pulling back the volcanic ash in Pompeii found over 80 of these shops in that small city alone. That means there was one Thermopolium for roughly every 250 residents. To put that into perspective, that's a per capita density even higher than fast food restaurants in modern New York City. The Romans practically invented the fast food industry out of pure urban necessity.
Section 4. The Ancient Street Food Menu.
So, what's actually cooking? The ancient menu was deeply comforting and incredibly varied. The foundation was pulse, a thick, hearty wheat porridge. But it didn't stop there. Imagine the smell of fresh sardines and mackerel cooking gently over glowing charcoal, the sound of sizzling filling the air. Just a few steps away, another vendor serves bowls of hot vegetable stew that's been cooking slowly since early morning. Beans, lentils, onions, leeks, and carrots, with a little olive oil glistening on the surface. You could grab small wheels of goat cheese, choose from bowls of olives, dark purple, deep green, nearly black, or buy fresh figs, grapes, and pears from a smiling farmer. It was a perfectly affordable, practical, and filling diet.
Interestingly, chemical analysis of the residue inside these clay jars reveals a secret ingredient: garum. This pungent fermented fish sauce was the absolute cornerstone of Roman flavor. It was basically the ancient equivalent of ketchup or soy sauce, bringing this rich umami depth to almost every dish. Romans loved it so much they added it to savory stews and, believe it or not, even sweet desserts.
And of course, no Roman meal was complete without bread. As you walk down the street, the comforting smell of warm bread fills the air. Imagine a baker carefully removing fresh round loaves from a large stone oven, steam rising gently into the afternoon sky. Customers wait patiently as each person receives a warm loaf wrapped in a simple cloth. Every loaf passed through many patient hands, from the massive stone mills of the Bakers Guild straight to the neighborhood streets.
Section 5. The Midday Rush. By midday, the quiet morning shifts into a totally chaotic rush of humanity. The poet Marshall beautifully captures this sensory overload. The shouts of vendors, the mouth-watering sizzle of sausages, the clinking of coins. The midday crowd was a cross-section of the entire city. You had tired builders brushing dust from their clothing, enslaved messengers running errands, merchants and even children playing beside the fountains. The Thermopolium wasn't just a place to eat. It was the absolute social hub of the neighborhood, where gossip and business were traded as freely as the food itself.
Section 6. Economics of the counter. Now let's look at the economics of all this, using Emperor Diocletian's Edict of Maximum Prices. If a laborer was making about 25 denarii a day, they couldn't exactly afford lavish meals. Customers bought only what they needed, nothing more, nothing less. A quick meal of walnuts for 4 denarii, or a bowl of hearty stew and diluted wine, fit perfectly into their daily budget. The vendor had to carefully balance the cost of ingredients sourced in the pre-dawn darkness with what the working class could actually afford to pay.
The margins were definitely tight, but for the hardworking, they were rewarding. Despite the brutal hours, rent fees, and the constant threat of city fires, a successful Thermopolium vendor could take home a net daily income of 10 to 20 sesterti. Through sheer grit and culinary skill, this street vendor could quietly out-earn a Roman legionary soldier. It was a very real path to financial stability in a harsh, ancient world.
As the golden sunlight softens across the rooftops of Rome, the streets become peaceful once again. Street vendors begin packing away the remaining foods. Unsold bread is safe for tomorrow. Clay bowls are washed carefully, and the last cooking fires burn gently beneath iron pots. Tomorrow morning, the ovens will be lit once more, and the simple rhythm of everyday life will begin all over again. I leave you with this. The next time you order fast food, are you just getting a quick meal, or are you sharing in a timeless 2,000-year-old ritual that kept the greatest city of the ancient world alive? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the incredible history.
Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. You know, when we picture ancient Romans eating, we usually imagine these wealthy emperors lounging around on couches, snacking on peeled grapes, or maybe eating some exotic birds. But for the vast majority of regular people living in the Roman Empire, breakfast, lunch, and dinner looked completely different. We're going to trace the actual, everyday journey of Roman food, starting way outside the city walls, just to see how the working class really survived. So, picture this. You've just finished a long day of work, and you head home to a massive, multi-story apartment building. The Romans called these insulae. They were super cramped, often going up to 6 stories high, with the poorest folks stuck on the very top floors. Now imagine trying to cook a meal up there. There was no running water, 0 modern stoves. Lighting an open wood fire in a densely packed wooden apartment block? Yeah, incredibly dangerous. Actually, in a lot of these buildings, cooking at home was literally illegal. Why? Because a single stray spark could, and totally did, burn down entire city blocks. Because of that massive fire risk and the total lack of kitchens, a staggering 90% of urban Romans relied entirely on street food. 90%. Think about that. The ancient Romans essentially invented the fast food industry out of pure necessity. 2,000 years before the drive-thru even existed, if you lived in an insula, you were eating out for practically every single meal. But before we hit the streets to check out those food stalls, we kind of need to understand where all this food actually came from. Section 1. The Quiet Roman Harvest. Let's step away from those crowded, noisy streets for a second. We're heading out to the peaceful countryside where every single loaf of bread actually began. Picture rolling hills and fields of golden wheat moving gently in the warm Mediterranean breeze. Farmers were out here waking up before the stars even faded, working the rich soil with wooden plows and strong oxen. And it wasn't just wheat and barley. They carefully handpicked olives from ancient trees to press into golden oil and gathered heavy clusters of purple and green grapes from the vineyards for wine. The whole family helped out. Parents, kids, grandparents. It was just this steady, unhurried rhythm. Out here, beneath the open sky, the earth rewarded patience far more often than haste. Section 2. Rome's Midnight Supply Chain. Okay, so once that quiet, peaceful harvest was collected, it had to get into the heart of the greatest city in the ancient world. And let me tell you, it didn't happen peacefully, and it definitely didn't happen during the day. Back in 45 BCE, Julius Caesar actually banned wheeled carts from the streets of Rome during daylight hours because the streets were just too narrow and packed. So the entire food supply chain roared to life in the dead of night, during what the Romans called the Tertia Vigilia, or the Third Watch. From midnight to 3 a.m., the city was absolutely chaotic. You had drivers shouting, live pigs squealing, massive wagons rumbling. Over 400,000 tons of grain came in from places as far as Egypt, processed through the massive emporium warehouses by the river. And before the sun even came up, street vendors were already at the main wholesale market, the Macellum, haggling for fresh fish and veggies to feed the waking city. Section 3. The Bread and Bakery Boom. Out of all those nocturnal imports, nothing, and I mean nothing, was more critical than grain. Bread was the absolute backbone of the Roman diet. It completely transformed an ancient culture of porridge eaters into a massive bread-dependent society. What we are looking at here are actual ruins from Pompeii, and they perfectly show just how industrial Roman baking was. Back in 168 BCE, they formed the Collegium Pistorum, the official bakers' guild. These professional bakers didn't just bake, they milled the imported grain right there in their shops. And the government regulated this heavily because keeping the public fed literally meant keeping the empire secure. Happy stomachs equaled happy citizens. If you walked past one of these Roman bakeries, you wouldn't just see one boring type of bread. Artisan bakers experimented wildly. You had this coarse, dark panis rusticus for the everyday folks, and then a super refined, crazy expensive white bread called panis siligineus for the rich. They even had panis buletis, which was shaped like a mushroom and covered in poppy seeds, or Alexandrian bread, imported and flavored with exotic cumin. Bread was everywhere, for sure, but it wasn't the only thing tying the empire's culinary world together. Section 4. Garum, Rome's favorite condiment. All right, to truly understand Roman flavor, we have to talk about the ancient world's answer to ketchup, garum. So, what exactly is it? Garum was a fermented liquid fish sauce. They take small fish, or honestly sometimes the blood and innards of larger fish like tuna, layer them with salt and aromatic herbs, and just leave them out in the hot sun to ferment and break down for months. I know, it sounds pretty awful to us now, and frankly, the smell of it brewing was notoriously terrible. But the resulting liquid? It was this massive umami bomb, and the Romans poured it on absolutely everything. This wasn't just some niche, weird ingredient either. It was a huge global industry. Look at these massive terracotta vats. They're called dolia, excavated right out of a garum shop in Pompeii. They held the liquid part, the liquamen, and the solid, sludgy leftover called alec. Cooks would take that pungent liquid and pour it directly into simmering stews. It gave this incredibly deep, savory, salty flavor to the daily meals of millions of citizens. Section 5. The Ancient Fast Food Empire. So, we've gone from the quiet fields to the chaotic midnight markets, past the bakeries and those stinky garum vats. Let's look at where it all finally comes together. This is a thermopolium. Think of it as the 2,000-year-old equivalent of a food truck or a modern fast food counter. In Pompeii alone, which was a town of just 20,000 people, archaeologists have found over 80 of these things. You'd walk up to these really beautiful fresco-painted stone counters. See those large holes? They held those terracotta jars, those dolia, to keep the food steaming hot or comfortably cold. You'd literally just point to what you wanted, hand over a few cheap bronze coins, and grab your lunch on the go. But what were they actually serving? The menu was surprisingly complex. The main staple was pulse, a super thick, hearty porridge made from that wheat we saw being harvested earlier. If you had a sweet tooth, you'd probably grab libum. A delicious cake made of fresh sheen, obviously, but it was almost always diluted with water. Drinking straight wine was basically considered barbaric back then. These street vendors brilliantly combined sweet, savory, and fermented flavors right there on the street. It was incredibly sophisticated fast food, proving the working class still had access to deeply complex culinary experiences. Section 6. Eating by social class. Now, while the bustling fast food counter was the heartbeat of the city, we can't ignore that food was also the ultimate status symbol. The culinary divide was just staggering. The common people, the plebeians, ate their porridge and cheap sausages standing up at street counters. But the wealthy patricians? They lived in a completely different culinary universe. The elite had massive private kitchens, enslaved cooks, and threw these highly theatrical banquets. We're talking exotic meats sourced from the edges of the empire, like camel and peacock. The Emperor Vitellius famously threw feasts featuring thousands of dishes at a time. It was all about showing off the sheer reach and wealth of Rome on one single dining table. In stark contrast to the decadence of the emperors, we also have to look at the military that actually built the empire. The Roman legionary diet was strict and highly organized. A soldier's ration was 75% unmilled grain. They were actually forced to process and prepare their own food just to prevent idleness in the camps. They'd supplement that grain with meat, cheese, and olive oil, and they hydrated with a drink called pasca. It was a mix of water and vinegar that was cheap, totally safe to drink, and actually surprisingly refreshing on those long, grueling marches. So, when we step back and look at the whole picture, the story of Roman food is truly phenomenal. It's the story of a civilization that mastered a vast, incredibly complex supply chain. From the quiet, hopeful harvest in the sun-drenched Italian countryside to the chaotic midnight markets on the Tiber River, all the way to the warm, savory smell of a fast food counter at noon. It was just a highly organized, deeply flavorful world. So I'll leave you with this to think about. If you could time travel right now, walk up to one of those beautiful stone counters in ancient Pompeii, hand over a few bronze coins, and smell the garum, the baking bread, and the honey, what would you order? Thanks for joining me on This Explainer. Keep wondering, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. We're totally stripping away those glittering marble columns, we're ignoring the emperors, and we're forgetting all about the gladiators for a moment. Instead, we're setting the stage to uncover the gritty, fascinating, and honestly, wonderfully chaotic reality of everyday ancient Roman life. We're going to look at what they actually ate every day, how they slept, and really focus in on the people who physically built and fed the empire, the bakers, the farmers, the ordinary plebeians. Right off the bat, I want you to ask yourself, what if your roommate was a literal goat and your pillow was made of solid wood? Pretty wild, right? It instantly shatters that whole illusion of luxurious Roman palaces. Because if you were an ordinary peasant, your daily reality definitely wasn't lounging in a heated bathhouse. It was more of a dirt-floored survival test where a literal block of wood was considered a perfectly acceptable place to rest your head. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. Fueling the Roman Machine, Dawn of an Empire. To really understand this world, we have to start our chronological journey at the very beginning of the day, because long before the sun even thought about peeking over the horizon, a massive amount of physical effort was already underway. Just look at the grueling pre-dawn timeline of an everyday Roman baker. Hours before dawn, they're already up, dragging heavy sacks of imported wheat and grinding it into flour, entirely by hand. By pre-dawn, they're heading out to fetch cool water from the public aqueduct fountains just to mix the dough. As early morning hits, they're kneading and shaping that dough on these worn wooden tables. It's a hugely demanding physical task. And finally, right as the sun rises, they're sliding those loaves into massive, roaring brick ovens. It was a relentless daily routine that relied purely on physical stamina to feed the waking city. And here is the wildest part for me. The number of modern tools they used was absolutely zero. None. No digital scales, no precise thermometers, and actually scratch the idea of commercial yeast packets too. A baker relied entirely on their gut instinct, the literal feel of the dough, and a chunk of leftover fermented dough from the day before to make their bread rise. All right, moving to section 2, the evening meal, patricians versus plebeians. Let's fast forward through that grueling day of labor to when the sun finally begins to set. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how vividly it contrasts these two completely different worlds at dinner time. For the wealthy patricians, dinner was this luxurious, hours-long event. They literally reclined on special dining couches, enjoying multi-course meals with fine wine and meats, often at these lavish parties with live entertainment. But for the plebeians, the ordinary working class we're focusing on, it was a completely different story. They sat upright on simple wooden stools in a single room, having a quick family meal. And their menu? It was basically a survival diet. Vegetable porridge, rock-hard bread, some olives, and if they were incredibly lucky, maybe a tiny bit of fish or some watered-down wine. But here is a brilliant little twist. Despite that vast, gaping canyon of difference in their wealth and their menus, neither class used forks. The fork, as an eating utensil, was completely unknown to ancient Romans. So whether you were a wealthy patrician lounging in expensive silk or a tired plebeian sitting on a wobbly wooden stool, you were eating mostly with your bare hands, maybe occasionally using a knife or a spoon. Section 3, Rome after dark. The city contracts. So as the sun goes down and those first stars appear over the city, the whole narrative shifts. You see, today, we're so used to modern comfort. Our evenings are brightened by streetlights and neon signs, but the ancient reality was a city plunged into near total darkness. In the daytime, Rome was visually open. It was loud, bustling with merchants everywhere. But nighttime, it became shadow-filled and, honestly, pretty dangerous. The physical world contracted. Just to navigate those narrow, uneven streets, you had to rely heavily on your memory, listen closely to the sounds around you, and literally feel your way along the cold stone walls just to find your front door. There's this fantastic quote that I think captures this perfectly. Night reshapes behavior. Journeys are shortened, movements are planned, people rely on memory, the feel of a wall beneath their hand. It really underscores how drastically the simple absence of light altered their psychology. Safety was absolutely not guaranteed after dark, and your entire routine was strictly dictated by the sun. Which brings us to Section 4, the peasant bedroom, a packed house. Because if the streets are dark and dangerous, well, you go home to sleep, right? But for the vast majority of the Roman population, going home introduced this chaotic, deeply unglamorous reality. Brace yourself for the sensory overload of a peasant hut at night. Your mattress? It's a sack of itchy straw or reeds that pokes you every single time you move. And you're sharing it with your entire family just to survive the freezing winter drafts. You're waging a constant and probably losing battle against fleas, bedbugs, and mice looking for stray crumbs. Plus, you've got actual barnyard roommates, we're talking goats, pigs, and chickens, roosting right there in the room with you, snorting and shifting all night long. Your only source of heat is a smoky central fire pit that leaves you smelling entirely like a campfire, and you wake up every morning coated in a fine layer of dust from the dirt floor. And this brilliantly illustrates the utter absurdity of their sleeping arrangements, the Roman peasant pillow. Forget memory foam or goose feathers, you rested your head on a literal, sturdy block of wood. It offered maximum neck discipline and a total, absolute lack of ergonomic comfort. It pretty much guaranteed that you woke up stiff, sore, and ready to face the day simply because lying in bed was just too uncomfortable to continue. Let's move to Section 5 and see how this builds. First and second sleep, the midnight awakening. Because they didn't just sleep through all of this chaos in one go. They practiced this historically accurate, somewhat bizarre concept of experiencing the night through segmented sleeping. Here's how the natural progression of the ancient sleep cycle actually worked. Step 1 was the first sleep. You basically just crash from pure physical exhaustion as soon as it gets dark. Then comes Step 2, the midnight awakening. You actually wake up in the pitch black for an hour or two. Now, today, we'd call this severe insomnia, right? But to them, it was perfectly normal. You'd use this time for chores, whispering with family, or maybe grabbing a bite. Then Step 3, you finally go back for your second sleep until the rooster inevitably screams at dawn. And if you got hungry during that midnight awakening, the reality of an ancient midnight snack was incredibly gritty. There's no convenient refrigerator glow here. You are fumbling around in pitch darkness, gnawing on rock-hard stale bread, maybe scraping up some leftover beans from the dinner pot or hunting for some desperate olives. And you're doing all of this while trying your absolute hardest not to trip over the family pig or wake the sleeping chickens. Plus, you aren't just eating, you were working. Nighttime was full of relentless chores that constantly interrupted whatever rest you were trying to get. You had to wake up to stoke the dying embers of the central fire pits the family wouldn't freeze. If a storm rolled in, you were out there placing broken pots in the dark to catch rainwater dripping from a leaky thatched roof. You might have to shout at a neighbor's loud donkey or go check the gate to ensure the ox hadn't wandered off into the night. For a Roman peasant, it turns out even sleeping was basically a full-time job. So the crucial point is this. When we think of Rome, we so often think of the massive monuments, the famous emperors, and the grand, sweeping speeches. But every single stone road, every massive aqueduct, every single loaf of bread, and every mud brick home was built by hands that history rarely recorded. The resilience, the sheer grit, and the unrecorded labor of these ordinary people working from before dawn all the way through their fractured midnight sleep is what actually kept the empire alive. Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. With the wooden pillows, the chaotic midnight chores, the goat roommates, and the grueling pre-dawn labor, how many nights do you honestly think you would survive in an ancient Roman peasant hut? It definitely makes you appreciate your soft mattress and modern climate control a whole lot more, doesn't it?
Okay, let's dive straight into this explainer and completely shatter the myth that every ancient Roman spent their days lounging on couches, dining on roasted peacocks, camel meat, and wild boar.
The reality of daily life in the greatest city of the ancient world was vastly different and, honestly, a whole lot more relatable to our modern lives than you might think.
So, the crucial point we need to understand is that 90% of Romans did not have private kitchens. They lived in high-rise apartment buildings called insula. These ancient apartment blocks were crammed together along really winding streets, stacked up to 6 stories high, with absolutely no running water and no ovens for the vast majority of the people living there. Imagine trying to feed 1 million people in those conditions.
Now, you might wonder, why not just build a small fire inside? Well, indoor fires were a terrifying hazard in these cramped, wooden-framed spaces. In fact, most Romans were legally prohibited from cooking at home because open flames regularly caused massive, deadly fires that could literally burn down entire city blocks. Because of this, the working population was forced to rely on an incredibly complex and highly efficient street food network.
Section 1. Ancient fast food.
The Romans essentially invented the fast food joint. They called it a thermopolium. These were beautifully frescoed stone counters facing the street, featuring large embedded terracotta clay jars known as dolia. A hungry worker, or maybe a student between classes, could literally just walk up, point at a steaming jar, drop a few small bronze coins on the counter, and eat a hot meal right there on the street.
What's truly staggering here is the sheer scale of this operation. The small town of Pompeii alone, with a population of roughly 20,000, had over 80 thermopolia. That is one fast food counter for every 250 residents. To put that into perspective, that's more fast food joints per capita than modern New York City has McDonald's. Some streets had a vendor every 50 feet.
And their menus offered a stunning variety of complex flavors. They served everything from pulse, which is a hearty, savory wheat porridge often mixed with cheese and herbs, to something called isissia aumentata. This was ground meat mixed with pine nuts, pepper, and bread, wrapped in a thin layer of fat and cooked over an open flame. Yeah, it was essentially the ancient ancestor of the hamburger. And for dessert, you could grab a libum, a warm, sweet cheese and honey cake baked on bay leaves.
But getting all this food into the city was an absolute logistical nightmare. To keep the narrow, crowded streets safe for pedestrians, wheeled carts were legally banned in Rome during daylight hours. This meant the entire food supply chain operated in complete darkness. A street food vendor's day began hours before dawn, navigating the noisy, chaotic river markets in the dead of night to source the absolute freshest ingredients from farmers and fishmongers.
Section 2. Bread, nuts, and staples.
Okay, let's talk carbs, because bread was so vital to the empire that the government heavily regulated the Bakers' Guild, known as the Collegium Pistorum. These professional bakers milled grain in public facilities and created mass-produced staples like the panis quadratus. We actually have fossilized remains of these from Pompeii. They were large circular loaves cleverly slashed into quarters before baking so they could be easily broken apart and shared.
Over the centuries, Romans evolved from a nation of what early writers called porridge eaters into a society completely dependent on bread. The Roman state even subsidized basic bread and grain distributions to citizens through a system called the annona. This transformed the humble wheat loaf into a daily political and survival necessity. And when we look at the economic breakdown, taken from Diocletian's Edict of Maximum Prices, it reveals what average people could actually afford to eat with that bread. While a laborer making 25 denarii a day could easily buy 100 walnuts or chestnuts for a quick snack, pine nuts remained a rather expensive luxury, costing almost half a day's wage. Consequently, they were used really carefully, just to flavor premium street meats and special dishes.
Section 3. Rome's secret fish sauce.
You can't talk about Roman food without talking about garum. Garum was essentially the ketchup, soy sauce, and MSG of the ancient world all rolled into one. Created by naturally fermenting small fish and herbs in the sun for months, it gave Roman street food an intense umami flavor that balanced perfectly with sweet ingredients like honey, creating a really complex, layered flavor profile that feels incredibly modern.
And modern science gives us a fascinating look into Roman food manufacturing. Recent chemical analysis of Dahlia jars from a Pompeii garum shop reveals that vendors actively modified their products. They literally added iron to create a premium blood garum, intentionally altering the color to imitate higher-value luxurious foods. They were food scientists as much as they were chefs. Garum was everywhere, from the legions shivering in the mud on the empire's furthest frontiers in Britain to the bustling, hot street corners of the capital. Consuming garum was a fundamental expression of Roman cultural identity. For them, it was the taste of home.
Section 4.
The evening meal, also known as the cena.
Let's slow things down a bit. The afternoon sun has now begun its slow descent toward the western horizon. Golden light spreads gently across the rooftops of ancient Rome. The chaotic, busy markets gradually become quieter. The sound of wooden cartwheels slowly fades into the distance as another peaceful day comes to an end. This highlights a stark class divide. While history often focuses on emperors throwing grotesque theatrical feasts, the average plebeian family was just returning home. Builders brushing dust from their clothes, farmers carrying baskets of vegetables, all gathering for a simple, unhurried evening meal. Inside a modest Roman house, the evening fire is already burning. Its warm orange glow fills the small kitchen with gentle light. Unlike breakfast, this cena is unhurried. There is finally time to sit together. A large clay pot of lentil stew simmers slowly above the fire, filling the room with the rich aroma of onions, garlic, carrots, herbs, and olive oil. Alongside this, the family would enjoy fresh cabbage, leeks, turnips, and carefully sliced goat cheese, everything grown with care.
Leaving the noise and dust of the streets at the threshold, sometimes marked with a "Beware of the Dog" mosaic, the home became a quiet sanctuary. Before eating, the family quietly washes their hands using water from a clay pitcher. The youngest child receives the first piece of bread. The oldest grandparent smiles gently before everyone begins eating. Conversation is soft, no one rushes. And for dessert, maybe a handful of grapes or a few ripe figs shared with deep gratitude.
After dinner, absolutely nothing is thrown away. The remaining bread is wrapped carefully. The stew is covered for tomorrow. Clay bowls are washed beside the fire. Every object is treated with care. We even see this everyday pride in their food recorded in ancient graffiti, serving as a permanent testament to the meals that sustain them.
As darkness settles over ancient Rome, the family gathers beside the glowing fire one final time. Stories are shared quietly. Outside, shopkeepers close their wooden doors, oil lamps begin glowing beside homes, and thousands of stars slowly appear. It leaves us to wonder. We grab fast food on the go, we navigate crowded streets, and we eventually seek the quiet, comforting glow of an evening meal at home. Are we really so different, or are we all just ancient Romans in modern clothing? Think about that the next time you grab a burger on your way home.